Impressionism in classical music is basically what happens when a bunch of French composers looked at German Romanticism, all those thundering horns, 4-hour operas about Norse gods, and Wagner making everyone feel things for 6 hours straight, and said, no thank you. We would like music that sounds like fog. And thus began one of the strangest and most beautiful rebellions in the history of art, one that started, embarrassingly enough, with a painting nobody even liked.
Let's set the scene. It's 1874, and Claude Monet submits a hazy little canvas called Impression, Sunrise, to an exhibition in Paris. A critic named Louis Leroy takes one look at this blurry orange smudge of a harbor and writes a scathing review, basically calling it unfinished wallpaper, sarcastically dubbing the whole style Impressionism as an insult. The painters, in the great tradition of artists everywhere, decided to just keep the name out of spite. 20 years later, a young composer named Claude Debussy, no relation to Monet, but cosmically ordained to share both a first name and a critical drubbing, starts writing music that does with sound what Monet did with paint. Blur the edges, dissolve the form, and let atmosphere do the talking, instead of a tidy melody marching from A to B like a well-behaved soldier. Critics, ever consistent in their inability to recognize genius when it's dripping wet in front of them, immediately slapped the same label on Debussy's music. Debussy, for the record, absolutely hated it. He much preferred to be called a symbolist, aligning himself with poets like Mallarmé and Verlaine. But history is written by whoever coins the catchiest insult, and Impressionism stuck to classical music like fog to a Parisian rooftop. The real origin story, though, involves less painting and more of a life-changing field trip. In 1889, Paris hosted a World's Fair, the same one that gave us the Eiffel Tower, and tucked among the exhibits was a Javanese Gamelan orchestra, all gongs and metallophones playing scales nobody in the Paris Conservatoire had ever sanctioned. Debussy, then a broke and rebellious student who'd already been expelled from certain academic assumptions for refusing to resolve his chords properly, heard this gamelan music and had what can only be described as a full-blown compositional religious experience. Suddenly, the rigid, functional harmony he'd been drilled in at the Conservatoire, every chord must lead dutifully to the next, like a Victorian chaperone escorting young lovers, seemed hopelessly restrictive. Why should a chord have to resolve anywhere? Why not just let it hang there, shimmering, like a chord on vacation? This is the exact energy that would define Impressionist music for the next 3 decades. Musically speaking, here's what these composers actually did that made everyone's ears do a double take. They ditched the major-minor scale system that had run Western music since basically forever, and started using whole tone scales, pentatonic scales, and church modes borrowed from centuries earlier, all of which have a way of making music sound like it's floating rather than walking. They stacked up extended chords, ninths, 11ths, 13ths, and then, in a move that would make any harmony professor clutch their pearls, moved these lush chords in parallel motion, a technique called planing, which is a bit like taking a beautifully decorated cake and just sliding the whole thing sideways instead of cutting it properly. They obsessed over timbre and orchestral color, the way a chef obsesses over plating, often prioritizing the shimmer of a flute and harp combination over whether the piece technically went anywhere. Rhythm got fuzzy too, favoring free-flowing, almost improvisatory pacing over the metronomic marching of the Romantics. The net effect is music that feels less like a story being told and more like a memory being recalled, or a light shifting across water, which, not coincidentally, is exactly what a huge chunk of the repertoire is literally about. Debussy's Prélude à la Prémédie d'un Faun, composed in 1894 and based on a poem by Mallarmé about a very horny woodland creature having an ambiguous afternoon, is generally treated as the starting gun of musical modernism itself. It opens with a solo flute meandering through a scale that refuses to commit to any key,
which was, at the time, roughly as scandalous as showing up to the opera in your pajamas. The composer Pierre Boulez, decades later, said modern music began with that flute solo, which is a very fancy way of saying Debussy broke music and everyone loved it. Debussy followed this with La Mer, an orchestral triptych about the ocean that somehow manages to sound exactly like standing on a boat while slightly seasick in the best possible way, and the opera Pelléas and Mélisande, which replaced Wagnerian bellowing with hushed conversational vocal lines floating over harmonies so vague they practically apologize for existing. Then there's Maurice Ravel, who gets lumped into Impressionism constantly and spent a fair amount of energy politely protesting the label, largely because his music, unlike Debussy's intentional haze, is engineered with the precision of a Swiss watch that happens to be extremely good at describing water. His piano piece Jeu d'eau, meaning playing water or fountains, splashes around with dazzling technical clarity, and his ballet Daphnis and Chloe is often called the most gorgeous orchestral score ever written by someone who also secretly loved jazz and mechanical toys. Between Debussy's foggy mysticism and Ravel's crystalline precision, you basically get the two flavors of French Impressionism. One composer painting with a wet brush, the other painting with a very, very fine one. The style didn't stay in France either, because good ideas about ambiguous chords tend to travel. Italy's Odorino Respighi borrowed the orchestral color for his tone poems about Roman pines and fountains. England's Frederick Delius soaked his pastoral scores in the same harmonic haze. America's Charles Tomlinson Griffiths wrote pieces so drenched in whole-tone shimmer, you'd think he'd been personally handed a beret. Manuel de Falla brought a Spanish accent to the same palette, and a young Igor Stravinsky absorbed enough of it to influence even his more famously riot-inducing later work. The influence of all this extends embarrassingly far beyond the concert hall. Those lush, extended chords Debussy and Ravel popularized became the backbone of jazz harmony, meaning every time a lounge pianist drops a ninth chord to sound sophisticated, they are unknowingly quoting a guy who got mocked for writing music that sounded like clouds. Film composers lifted the technique wholesale for scoring anything involving mist, oceans, dreams, or emotionally complicated flashbacks. And philosophically, Impressionism cracked open the whole idea that music had to resolve, had to march toward a destination, had to behave. A crack that later composers would kick wide open into full atonality and beyond. So really, the next time you hear a chord that just sort of hangs there, gorgeous and unresolved, refusing to tell you how it feels, you can thank a flute-playing Faun, a room full of Javanese gongs, and two Frenchmen named Claude and Maurice, who decided music didn't need a plot, just weather.